Welcome back to Society Case Files. My name is Robert, and today I want to do a video that is going to have some tips about building. It's not like a comprehensive video per se, but it's quite a few things that you need to know when you first get started with building miniatures. So I'm sitting here at my build station that I normally film for all of the different builds that you've seen on the channel so far, and I thought I would just talk about a few of the things that make sense to me and that I used to get started and the things I've learned along the way. If you like this kind of content and you want to see more, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. But without further ado, let's dive into the video itself. And we're going to start with the first tip, and that is to make sure that you compile the right tools. Some of this is pretty obvious if you've started because maybe you've watched another video that told you the things to get, or you went to a Warhammer store. Whatever the case may be, the primary thing that you're going to need is a pair of clippers so that you can cut the pieces off from the sprues. Once you have that, pretty much everything else is just a little extra. It's nice to have, but it's not absolutely essential. Especially if you are a rank beginner, there's certain things that you might fixate on a little bit more than you absolutely have to in order to get started. So, for example, it's important to have something like a pallet knife to clean up little blemishes or even to scrape down mold lines on your miniatures to help them be smoother and have the aesthetic that was intended for them. There are other specific tools for that as well. You can find those at the Warhammer store. There are very cheap options on Amazon to get that are, well, let's just put it this way. Some of the stuff at the Warhammer store costs well above $20 when you could get something at a craft store for a few bucks. One last thing I want to discuss before moving on from the tools is the Citadel plastic glue. Now, you can use super glue for this, which you can procure anywhere, and it's actually fairly cheap. However, the plastic glue that Games Workshop puts out is a particular substance that melts the plastic together, so it impacts that. But if you get it on your fingers, you're not sticking together like you would with super glue, because honestly, if you get super glue on your fingers, you can get stuck together, and then you've got to, take care of that, and that sucks. Now, I haven't used super glue in a number of years, so I don't even remember how bad it is, but I have been told that when you get stuck together, it can actually hurt. This stuff doesn't do that. You could get it on your fingers, it just washes right off. But with plastic, it melts them together, and it's ideal. It's pretty much, it is made for this. Now, the trick is, of course, it is more expensive, and it only works on the plastic models. It does not do anything for resin. So if you get into resin, you're right back to using super glue. And anything outside of the Games Workshop line pretty much is resin. So, for example, if you decided to play Fallout, Wasteland, Warfield, whatever it's called, I can't remember the name right now, but the Fallout miniature game, that's all resin. I looked into it. I was thinking about making some of those models. I wanted dog meat because I've got a dog army, but no, it's all resin, and I didn't want to put that together because I'm just not there yet. So keep that in mind. The glue is great. It is a little expensive. It's like $12 for a little amount. However, that said, I made well over 200 models with one of those, and a couple of those models were massive pieces of terrain and the big dragon before I ran out. So it is worth it, and I like it. I find it to be very convenient, and again, you're not getting your fingers stuck together, so that's a big thumbs up. To sum up, you need to get yourself some clippers, something to clean up the mold lines and the blemishes, and probably a file, because there are times that when you get in there with the pallet knife, you're going to risk damaging details when you could just use a precision file and take care of it. These are available at craft stores for a ridiculously low price. Overall, you should be able to find everything you need at your average place like Michael's or something like that. You do not have to go out and drop the kind of cash that they want at the Warhammer store. Now, if money is no object and you just want the stuff that is quote-unquote made for the job, then absolutely go there, get what you need, and you should be good to go. They have starter kits that also have this stuff in them. And then finally, the Stormbringer subscription service comes with all the tools eventually. It doesn't start off with everything. In fact, it took around 45 magazines before we got the texture tool that we were looking for. But long before that, we got the other tools that were necessary as well. Of course, by then, I had already been doing this for a while, so they were just extra. But if you are brand new, then Stormbringer might be a good choice for you, because then not only do you get models, but you get the tools to work with them as well. And in each issue, it goes into great depth on not only how to build it, but how to paint it and prep it for actual play. So there you go. Tools, essential. But that's just number one. Let's move into some more specific to building models techniques. So I'm not actually going to cut this sprue up, but I will show you that when you are cutting out the pieces, they're all connected. In this case, this one is connected twice, once to his arm and once to a sword. So if I'm going to go in here and clip this out, I'm going to want to put the flat edge of the clippers against the model piece, so away from the connection point of the sprue. If you've watched my other videos, you've seen me cut out dozens of things. And if you haven't yet watched one, watch any of them and you'll see how to cut things out. That's a good tutorial on how it works. And you'll see me cut out plenty of small pieces and some pretty hefty ones as well. The bigger the piece, the more connection points. So if you're doing a vehicle or a big behemoth model, there's a good chance that you're going to be cutting 5 or even 10 different connection points just to get that piece out. It's also important to be very patient and not refit around or try and twist it off, because you're just going to create extra work for yourself afterwards, where you're going to have to break out the pallet knife. And it probably should go without saying that you need to be really careful with the pallet knives. Everybody I've seen on YouTube talk about the pallet knife has given some kind of horror story about something that happened to them. Mine is not necessarily a horror story, but I have nicked myself a few times, and it was horribly painful. And quite honestly, those wounds are just not fun to have, especially when you're working with stuff like glue and all this other stuff. You don't really want to stop and then get a Band-Aid on and then have to fight with it. So just be really careful. Always make sure that you cut away from yourself. Keep your fingers out of the way. Don't go at it too hard. If you're struggling to cut a bit off of a sprue part, chances are your knife is dull and you just need to change out the blade. Hopefully that's a good tip that you are learning before you've tried any of that stuff, because it would be very frustrating to find out the hard way. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that when you cut things off a sprue, there are times that they will go quite crazy and just fly off the sprue if you're not holding it. Now, obviously, there are some parts on this sprue that would be hard to get your hand around while cutting at the same time, especially when you're turning it around to get a good contact point. And occasionally, it's hard to tell where the contact point ends and the model begins. So you have to flip it over to the side that doesn't have the numbers so that you can get at it. Now, in those cases, it would be good to make sure that you get as far over the table as you can so that the piece falls onto the table as opposed to the floor. Otherwise, you're going to be crawling around all over the place. Now, depending on your setup, that may not be a big deal. For me, it's not a horrible issue, other than the fact that I hate crawling around on the floor, and I drop stuff so much that I should just learn to love it. I should take it as a crucible. However, because I'm an ass and I refuse to do that, I try my best to keep them up here. That said, you can't see my floor, but sadly, my aesthetic demanded that I get a gray laminate vinyl plank floor. So these things almost blend in a little too well. So for my part, and I know this is probably silly, but I have this flashlight so that if something falls, I can just turn it on and find it and then hunt it down that way. If you've got a carpet and it's a contrary color to this gray, that would help a lot. If you've got a rug you can put down there, that would help a lot. And of course, if you're not sharing the space, losing a piece probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But if you've got a cat or any pets, small kids, then you clearly want to make sure that you find everything that falls on the floor when it does happen. Not too long ago, I actually lost a piece, and it was super frustrating because it was pretty much the third to the last thing I needed to finish the model. And it fell on the floor, and somehow it bounced absolutely perfectly and went directly underneath a very heavy amplifier. I didn't even know that there was space under the amplifier for something to get to because it was on carpet. So it didn't even really dawn on me to check. But after about, I don't know, an hour of giving up, I checked for about 30 minutes, couldn't find it, gave up. And I'm sitting in the house and I thought, wait, there's just no way it's there, but I got to check. Of course it was. And so keep in mind that these are so small that in some cases they can get places that you would never imagine. Bit of trauma from me to you to hopefully help you figure it out. Early on in the process of building, I found that the parts were too small to see, even with my reading glasses. Now, I'm an old bastard, so that's part of my problem. My wife doesn't have this issue when it comes to seeing the stuff up close. She's got no trouble with it at all. So she doesn't necessarily need what I'm about to talk about. But I use this magnifying glass for a lot of stuff. And when I first started, I used it for clipping out everything. So when I did my novitiates, when I did Necromunda models, they were always under this while I was clipping them out. This also has a light, which makes it much easier to see, and that's absolutely essential. It's really nice. It also helps with the filming so everyone can see what I'm doing. Now I pretty much only use this for painting. I haven't used it for building in quite some time, but there are moments where you're like trying to dry fit a model, which we'll talk about in a moment, and you just can't really see that contact point. And in those cases, it's nice to have this so that you can get in there and go, oh yeah, I do. I see where the seams meet. And it makes it a lot easier. So if you can invest in some sort of magnifying glass, I highly recommend it. This one was very inexpensive. It has this little plate at the bottom and it plugs in via USB. So all around, super convenient, lightweight, pretty easy to move. Probably the biggest challenge with this one is the fact that it has space underneath it for stuff to get lost or to slide under, like my glue cap likes to go under there quite a bit. Now, there's another one that I just saw that I really like. It's this sort of half moon light shaped thing. It's like $70. You can put a phone on top of it to film straight down, and it provides a lot of lighting. It seemed really cool. Obviously, no magnifying glass, but as far as lighting is concerned, it probably trumps this thing considerably because you'd get a lot more area involved. That's just something to keep in mind if you just want more lighting. Let's talk about dry fitting. Now, dry fitting is the act of basically putting the model together without glue so that you can make sure that you know what you're about to do before you make the full commitment. I dry fit literally everything, even push together models. I don't shove them in too far, but I make sure that I know that that is the place where they're going to connect and that it makes sense. And so when I do apply glue, it will work. Now, I consider dry fitting to be sort of this 3D puzzle game. That's like, instead of an actual jigsaw puzzle, I'm taking pieces from a model and putting them together. And then the glue is just the solidification of that process. Thinking about it like that got me a lot more excited in the hobby because at first the building part seemed like the lamest part to me. I was like, oh, this is just the hard part to get to the painting, which will be fun. And you're going to have a visual representation of everything cool about it. And then you're going to get to play the game. Then I just became absolutely enthralled with building because it's just such an awesome form of problem solving and troubleshooting and just getting in there and figuring things out, especially some of these harder models or models that have poor instructions, which then task you to figure things out more on your own. That said, dry fitting is essential. You'll know exactly what you're doing. Always make sure to do it. You'll see it in all my videos. I'm dry fitting everything before I attempt to put glue on it and make it happen. And let's talk about the difference between push together and the other models. The push together have pegs. They're basically guides that help you get the models together. They are technically considered much easier. Games like The Cursed City and some of the starter sets always come with push together. And they are easier by and large because you don't have to figure out how those pieces go. The instructions are fairly good when it comes to those. The trick with push together, though, is that those pegs sometimes are very difficult to push into place. And so that's where glue comes in. While the instructions do say you don't need any glue, technically speaking, I think you do. The very first model, the absolute first model I tried to put together was one of the free ones that they gave me at the Warhammer store the day I went. I went in and I said, I'm interested in this hobby. I'm ready to go. What do I do? He handed me a sprue and a base, and he says, this is your free one. Whatever else you want, here are some essentials you need to buy, blah, blah, blah. So I took that home and I said, I'm going to try this one first. And I just did push together. And there was just stuff about it that didn't work for me. For example, I didn't get the head on quite right. It moved, it wiggled. With glue, that wouldn't have happened. So as I have gone forward, I glue everything. It's also just more secure. It's not going to fall apart. And in some cases, there are push together instructions to where they wouldn't stay if you just pushed them together. For example, in the Black Talons, there's a character who has a hammer, and you got to put the front on the hammer. Well, there was no connection that really held it. It was just a peg to show you how it went, a guide, basically. So if you didn't glue that, it would have just fallen off. But I always think that putting on the glue is going to help more than not, especially in the case of lubing up those little pegs so that they slide into their positions easier. If you don't do that, then you can find it to be a struggle. Some of them are really hard to push in. I have tried a few without it just to see, and it is actually annoying. So that's just something to keep in mind. I glue everything. You can glue everything. There's nothing saying you shouldn't. In fact, they're just more secure, and you'll feel it. Like all of those models that I have from the Underworlds box sets, 20 different warbands, all of them pushed together, all of them are glued together, and they feel a lot more secure. Now, of course, that means that the ones that aren't pushed together generally do not have any guides. So you've just got to kind of figure it out. The instructions may or may not be great. I have some videos on here specifically about models that had terrible instructions so that I can show how I figured out what was going on there. Because on occasion, you're like, what does this even mean? Like, I don't get it. This amorphous mass is going to go there somehow. I don't get it. And in those cases, it's important to take your time and dry fit. But when you get to the point that you have to commit and put the glue on, then you really do want to know for a fact that you're right. I will tell you that occasionally I have not been 100% convinced that I was right. In fact, I've got a video coming up for Krondus, a big dragon, and there were some things on there that I'm not entirely sure I did right, but I did them to the best of my ability with the instructions that I had. It looks mostly right, and now that he's done, he looks cool, but I wasn't as happy with a few of those because of that. So get as close as you can. It's still a hobby. It's yours. You paid for it. Do what you want and make sure that it looks good to your satisfaction. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in particular in just a moment, but I also want to talk about instructions because I have mentioned already that some of these instructions aren't great. And occasionally you're going to get to a point that you're going to read the instruction or look at that image and you're not going to have any idea what they're talking about because they picked an angle that made sense to them, but it doesn't make sense to you. And in those cases, it's just tough because you've got to just figure it out. You've got to twist it around and move it. And this is particularly hard on characters that aren't specifically humanoid. They might be like a little monster or a creature like the Sylvaneth who are trees, and they don't necessarily have the same proportions as a humanoid character would. And so you're in there just like, I have no clue. This doesn't make sense. And then you're off looking for a video from someone like me, or you're looking for an updated set of instructions, whatever the case may be, you run into a situation like that. So what I do and what I recommend is that before you get started on any of these, look through the instructions completely. Just see if any of them don't make sense right off the bat. And if you're like, whoa, what does that even mean? Then maybe this is not the model to jump into. You don't necessarily want to get to the part that doesn't make sense after you've done several other things. So maybe you're 2/3 of the way through the model and then you get towards the end and there's something that is just baffling. That just kind of sucks. It sucks to stop in the middle. Because you've got to go do research or you just need a break because it's frustrating. So make sure you read all the instructions. Sometimes you're going to find that by reading the instructions, one part is hard, but if you do this part next, then this part becomes easy. So like a great example is Aveline. It's a model from the Sisters of Battle. It has you put her legs on early on in the process. However, if you do so, they're just kind of resting there, even with glue, and you might be able to make it work, but you'd kind of have to let the glue dry for a while before you could move on. So if you put the next piece on, which basically provides you with more of a foundation for those legs, then you don't have to do that step where you're basically making it precarious. You'll have an easier time. That's not always the case. It's not always the case that you can skip ahead to make a previous step easy. However, as you get experience, you're going to look through the instructions, you're going to find moments like that, and you're going to know, oh, I should try that just to see. And again, dry fitting is king, because sometimes you can do some dry fitting in such a way that you're going to basically see whether the next steps are possible. And in some cases, it's actually a lot easier to go ahead and do a bunch of other things before you come back to a part that is a little bit more challenging. And that comes all the way back to what I was talking about with instructions that don't make sense. Sometimes you need to go ahead so that you can come back and go, oh, now I get it. Now I see how that works. And sometimes even the logic of the person who wrote the instructions suddenly makes more sense. Not often. I'm going to just be straight with you about that. Sometimes I still have no clue what they were talking about or who thought that was a good idea. That said, be sure to read all the instructions, find those key points, and as you do more builds, you're going to have the experience to know what parts to pay most attention to and which parts you can kind of freewheel a little bit. Let's talk about the satisfaction aspect of this. When I was talking about that, what I meant was when you are building things or you're doing any part of this hobby, you are the ultimate judge on whether or not it is good. You know, don't allow your fear of someone else's judgment to prevent you from trying something. Maybe you're like, I really want to build this Necromunda set, but it looks very complicated. There's a chance that you might screw up some of it. I have, and I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. But at the end, I knew a lot more than I did before. Now, to be fair, it was not a cheap mistake to make. So these aren't cheap. And I get it that you want to be as perfect as you can. But you can't beat yourself up, because in the beginning of building, you're going to be learning a lot of stuff. You're going to learn that you don't need to use as much glue as you think. You're going to learn that the dry fitting in some cases is not entirely necessary. You're going to learn that the tiniest pieces sometimes aren't even visible when you finish the model, and then you can make decisions on whether or not you even want to put them in. So through that process, through the learning phase, you've got to be nice to you. Now, my story about an ultimate failure comes from my beloved Sisters Novitiates, a kill team. And I was so excited about them. They look freaking awesome on the box. They are just amazing. So I got them. I decided that I was going to build them and some Eschers. Those were the two things I was most excited about. I busted them out. It was just hellishly hard because all of their parts were really small and they were tough to put together. They were tough to dry fit. I'd never done it before. Dry fitting was still weird. I'm sitting there with the magnifying glass doing something that probably would take me 30 minutes now. It took me 4 hours back then. And at the end, I had the models all built, and some of them were, quite frankly, shabby. Some of them just looked wrong. They were just, it wasn't quite as bad as like gingerbread house terrible, but I was less than thrilled by what I came up with. And then just to add insult to injury, I over-primed the Sisters and lost 60% of their details. They were just practically melted because I was using a cheap primer, and then I didn't like the color I chose, so I primed them again, and that primer was too thick, and then it was just layered on. I still painted them just to learn. I used them as my learning tool, but that was a $60 mistake, and that's not a joke. You know, I understand that, you know, not everybody has that much money to just burn on trying to learn how to do this. Now, speaking of learning, if you're going to pick something as a starter set to get going and try this stuff and do it in a way that isn't going to be super frustrating because the parts are pretty hefty and it's hard to break them. It's hard to have trouble like losing them on the floor. They're not tiny, tiny, tiny. You can manipulate them easily. My recommendation is a Space Marine or Chaos Space Marine set. So after I made my mistake with the sisters, and after I did the Eschers and experienced the hell of how small they were and me not knowing what I was doing, I went and picked up a set of Chaos Space Marines from Amazon, and it was like $40, might have been a little bit more than that, but it wasn't too expensive, and I had a whole bunch of them. And my goal was I was going to build them, and I was going to paint them, and those were going to be my test runs. I didn't want to paint stuff that I really loved because I didn't want to mess them up. So I bought these Chaos Space Marines, and I built the first couple, and I went in and I painted them, and I did everything. And I'll tell you, number one, they were super easy to build. Number two, there's lots of open space on them to paint. They were very easy to paint, and they've got plenty of detail for you to get as intense or not as intense as you want. Do you want to get super detailed and do the trim on their armor a different color and get in there and take care of like their little sigils and stuff? Go for it. You've got all that space. If you don't, you could battle line them and just get them as painted as you want and do some highlights and call it good. But as far as building goes, they were so easy. And after I had already tried the hard mode stuff, going into them was a breeze. And it was actually quite a bit of fun. Even though I didn't really care about that army and I didn't really want a Chaos army, having a few Chaos Marines, that didn't bother me. Now, had I known that I would eventually get into the Space Marines, I probably would have just bought a set of them. They're actually, honestly, a little easier because the Chaos ones have a bunch of flourishes that the Space Marines don't necessarily have. So that's a recommendation for your first time. Get something chunky, get something that has a lot of size to it so that you can build it. Orcs would be okay, but there's almost too many options for them, and in a way, they're almost too simple. And they do rely on you knowing a little bit more than you might at the very beginning because they don't necessarily have the best instructions. A lot of the orc sculpts are a little bit old. So it's something to keep in mind when you decide to go into this, that in a few instances, there are boxes that you'll buy that are very much old school, and then that relies on you knowing more than you might. Other boxes that are way easy. If you just want super fast wins, you might consider picking up the Rogue Trader set from the Imperial Agents. They're all pushed together. They're all monopose, and they take about 20 minutes to build, and you've just got beautiful models to start off with and paint. There's actually quite a few pushed together like that. I would say that the Warhammer Underworlds is another great decision to get started on the whole hobby because you can build the 4 or 5 models that it comes with very quickly. You can paint them, and then you can learn the rules very quick too. All around, that's probably my number one gateway at this point, just from having tried so many of the games. And just to sort of clarify, I've built 40K Kill Team. I've done Blood Bowl, Necromunda, and Age of Sigmar. The one thing I haven't done, and the one thing I'm not really willing to talk about, is I haven't done any resin models, which is a shame because a lot of the best Necromunda models, a lot of the coolest ones, all of the star players from Blood Bowl, they're all resin. And so I tried to demystify resin for myself to decide to try and build some. I watched a few videos, and I've got to be honest, it actually looks a lot more complicated than even I thought. I was afraid of them without knowing how hard they were. And now that I know how hard they are, it's crazy. There's things like you have to clean them with solutions to get all this debris off. You've got to do like special clipping to take off these little guidelines that were used for printing them. And then you have to use super glue. You can't use the plastic glue. So yeah, that's why I'm not super excited about trying resin. And I'm not really going to talk about that because, again, I haven't even done it. But there is a reason that the Warhammer site calls those expert models. Those are expert kits because they require you to do a lot of different stuff. And you can't use some of the standard practices that they recommend. So anyway, I've yammered on for nearly a half an hour. These are some very basic tips for getting into building. I think that it's a great starting point. The recommendations in particular are very useful to ensure that you are building the right things to start with. And just to use a conclusion here that's really important, if you are brand new, my recommendation in this order would be to try Warhammer Underworlds and get those small teams that you can build. They're pushed together and you'd be done with them quickly. Or if you'd rather get a bigger army, if you're more interested in something a little bit more intense, then consider the Stormbringer subscription service. You're going to get 80 sets of things. They're going to include paints. They're going to include tools, models, tons of models. The site I just saw suggested that the retail price for everything you get in there is over $2,000, and you get it for like around $1,400 when it's all said and done. The premium version that I bought costs $77 every time I get it, and I can't remember how often I get it. But I did just get a set of 4 and a premium model today, in fact, right before I started filming this video. You get so many things, but they are specific. You get pretty much a bunch of Uruks, Goblins, Stormcast Eternals, and then a smattering of other random things like some Sylvaneth and some Dwarves and a couple of Warbands and some terrain. But it is a great place to start because, again, it's going to have all of the training material you need as far as the magazine's concerned, and it's going to have additional things that you may not have even thought to buy, and it's all included. Each of the magazines is normally $14. If you go for the premium edition, it costs $17.99 a piece. For that money, you do get models like Krondis, the big dragon guy I talked about, and he's $130 by himself. So that one magazine makes him worth it. And then there are others like that too. So those are my 2 gateways to get into the hobby. And finally, if you're not interested in Underworld and you're just a 40K fan, pick a big chunky unit to start with. Get someone like the Space Marines, the Chaos Marines, some Orcs, someone that you have that is big to work with, that you can get into it, get your hands dirty, and just figure it out. I think those are your best bets. I could tell you this, final story, I promise. When I finally built a massive amount of Sisters and a whole bunch of Orcs and some skeletons here and there, I finally decided to get into the Daughters of Cain. And I watched a video before I did it, and the person in that video warned, these models are spindly. These models are very hard. And they weren't wrong, but after I built 10 Witch Elves, I felt like I was ready to take on anything. And in fact, I had tried to build some Necrons before I started them, and I failed miserably. I have the Necron kill team. It was a terrible experience. They were really, really, really tough. After I built those Witch Elves, I went back to the Necrons and I didn't have any more trouble. It was just a matter of really embracing small contact points and getting those pieces in there and manipulating multiple points of contact. So like if a character's holding a gun like so with 2 hands, you've got to do his shoulder, you've got to do this shoulder, and then you got to do the contact point between the hand and the weapon. And so with those 3 points of contact, fortunately these are small models, but you still got to find a way to get your hands and manipulate that without dropping the model or causing it to, freak out. Dry fitting that is really a challenge. But anyway, as you progress, I guess my point is, you're going to do a model set that sort of brings it all together, and you realize there's not really much that's going to challenge you. You're not going to get to a point where you're like, I have no idea what to do, because you'll have the problem-solving skills at that point to address anything that comes up. What do you think of the building process? Is building models fun to you? Is it daunting? Is it scary? Is it something you love? Is it just a necessary evil to get to the great part of painting and playing the game? Let me know in the comments below. But anyway, this is Robert from Society Case Files, signing off.